I'm speaking with Simon Butterworth, and the story here is that Simon played baseball in Ireland in the 1950s and 1960s, and his father was the person behind the establishment of baseball in Ireland.
He was born in I think the name of the town was Disley. When he was a small child, he'd been injured in an accident and had a very deformed foot. And anyway, he went off to Canada, attempted to be a farmer, didn't work, and then did all kinds of jobs in Canada, including working for a baseball team. He'd become very interested in baseball and worked as their secretary administrator for I don't even know how long. He also made a living playing music, which is another of his passions. And eventually in the middle 1930s, he came home, reacquainted himself with my mother, who he'd known as a child, and got married and had his leg amputated. It's all within the space of a couple of years.
Wow.
And then the war broke out. His intention was actually to go back to Canada. The war broke out. He got work in England and working for a tire retreading company called Tire Souls, which he did during the war. And then after the war, he started working with a consulting division of Tire Souls, and that he was helping a group of Irish chaps in Waterford start their first business. And the chap they'd hired to manage the business didn't work out, and my dad was offered the job, and he didn't, I don't think, thought 2 seconds about the offer with knowing he wanted it, because he'd fallen in love with Ireland in the few visits he'd made in the late 1940s. It reminded him of Canada, much more of a society that was on the move and pioneering, and he just loved it. And we basically started playing a modified baseball game on the beaches in the Tramore area with my 2 or 3 of my closer friends. Somewhere in the late 50s, we got enough interest in Tramore to put essentially 2 teams together of kids playing in Tramore. And one of those friends, Connor, that I mentioned, his dad was a farmer. And so we got a loan of some of his fields. I mean, couple of summers early on, we had to actually mow the grass before we could play on it. It was just a wild field. It was pretty crude. Quite often we would play a game where, there'd be only 14 or 15 of us, and some of us would go out and field for the other team. But we had fun. We'd get together once a week, sometimes twice. And then my father had running this tire retreading business in Ireland, had one of his sales guys was one of Waterford's great soccer players in his youth. Bill Barry, his name was. In any event, Bill got interested in it, and we started a baseball team in Waterford. He rounded up a bunch of kids, and he got a team going in Waterford. And then I think it was around 1965, my father moved to Dublin. The business had grown where the center of sort of activity was Dublin. And we moved to Dublin at that time, and then we started a team up in Dublin. As far as the equipment was concerned, that's certainly a very vivid memory and interesting one. He put his long-suffering wife and his 2 children to work, and we made baseball gloves. Initially, what he did was we got a baseball bat, some baseballs, and 1 glove imported it from the U.S., and then we took the glove apart, made patterns from it, and bought some local leather and leather thonging and assembled our own gloves. And then eventually the Japanese saved us, because my father discovered that we could buy stuff from Japan at 10% of what it was costing us to import from the U.S. And that's when he paid for it all. He had initially anyway, and I'm pretty sure he paid for it all right up, almost up to the end. The Moore Sea Lions, the Waterford Walruses, and I don't remember the if we had a name for the Dublin team. The American Air Force independently came to Dublin to do an exhibition softball game. My father immediately, made friends with the chap he was actually the director of athletics for the Air Force in Europe. And he gave us equipment. He gave us uniforms. He was at the Air Force. This guy was a sight to be seen. He talked slow. He was from Montana. He was 6'6" tall. His wife was 6'3". Walking around Ireland with this guy was like, people would just stop on the street and look at him. He brought in another two baseball teams to Waterford in the early 60s for an exhibition game. He impressed the hell out of all of us and taught us a lot.